Okay, so 1 Peter 5. That's where we're at. It's 1 Peter chapter 5. We've been making our way through. Last week we did the first 4 verses, and tonight we'll do a few more verses. And this passage is kind of like the passage last week, or at least a little bit of it is, in that it is an aside where Peter, who's our author, addresses a subset of his audience. So last week he called aside to the leaders, to the elders. Remember that? And the context here is that his audience, the recipients of this letter, are suffering. They're being persecuted for their faith. That's the theme that runs through this letter, is how to respond well to being mistreated and rejected and talked bad about. And that's what he's been giving them advice about the whole time. And last week he calls aside to the elders and he's like, look, you've got a special role in navigating this trial. We're all enduring this together. We're enduring suffering together is really the theme. And he's like, you guys as leaders I have a special charge for you that I want to make in front of everyone, which is that you have to shepherd the flock. That was what we studied last week. You guys got to lead through this trial. And so that's chapter 5, verse 1 and 2. Now, in our passage, starting in verse 5, he turns aside to a different group. So he's turned to the leaders, and now he says in verse 5, you younger men, likewise, be subject to your elders. And all of you, clothe yourself with humility toward one another, because God is opposed to the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, so that he may exalt you at the proper time, having cast all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. So that's our passage. And there's a theme to it. There's actually, these verses all go together. Do you guys see the theme? He repeats a couple times this word, humble yourselves. That's what this teaching is about, is humility. You came to a teaching on humility. Congratulations. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, thank God my husband came tonight to hear this. Just kidding. Humble yourself. That's what it's about. It's about being humble. And so, yeah, it will no doubt humble all of us, probably. The word here is really straightforward. It's very simple. It just simply means to bring low or to make low. That's all it means. He says, basically, guys, make sure to lower yourselves. Put yourself low. And actually, it's kind of lost on us in the English, but as you read through, a ton of these verses that he used are sort of high, low language, above and below, up, down. So I just want to show you that real fast. He says, you younger men, likewise, be subject, or literally, put yourselves under your elders. And all of you, clothe yourself with humility. That's the word for lowliness of mind, a mindset. Think of yourself not above others, but below others. Because God is opposed to the proud, and that's the word for thinking highly of yourself. Don't think above other people, think below other people. So he's opposed to the proud, but he gives grace to the lowly. Therefore, lower yourselves under the mighty hand of God, so that he may exalt or lift you up at the proper time, having cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. So this is what he's talking about. So what does it mean? Humble ourselves. That's really the main point. That's the topic here. The command is to clothe yourself with humility toward one another, and that's what we're going to be talking about. Now, why this topic? I think this is an important question because when I'm reading through 1 Peter, knowing that they're being persecuted, all the topics make sense to me. It's like how to endure suffering. That makes sense. How to respond to slander. That makes sense. How to win people over with excellent behavior. How to have your defense ready. Leading through trials. The next passage we're going to study, the last passage really, is about Satan, about God's enemy. These all make sense. And then right before the end, it's like, oh yeah, one other thing. In the fiery ordeal, one thing, make sure to be humble. Why? It must be important because it's his penultimate point of the whole book. Humble yourselves. It must be one of the essential pieces of equipment that we need if we're going to face trials for Christ, if we're going to follow Christ through difficulty. Counterintuitive as it may be, humility is pretty important. And so that's what I want to explore tonight as we think about that. I like how the command comes in. Again, it's another illustration. Clothe yourself. Literally, gird. So it's like put on humility like clothing. And I think that carries some implications too, that it's a command. He's not just saying, I hope that you're humble. I pray for, he's saying, guys, you need to clothe yourself with humility. He's appealing to your volition. Just like when you wake up in the morning, you can choose what you're going to wear, right? You make a decision how you're going to present yourself, how you're going to gird yourself that day, probably depending on what is in front of you. If you're going to mow the lawn, then you prepare yourself, you gird yourself accordingly. My kids just had their first day of school, 7th grader and a 4th grader, and you wouldn't believe the amount of conversation that went into what they were going to wear on the first day of school. It was like the topic of conversation among them and their friends. A ton of planning and thought went into it. My son opted for a t-shirt that says, I was told there would be ice cream. That's what he wore. That was the outcome of his calculated decision. Wants to get the best foot forward, I guess. So he's saying, make sure that you're clothed with humility. And then he also says, toward one another. So it's in a direction. Which, I don't want to push the illustration too far and read into stuff that isn't there. But I was thinking, when you clothe yourself, you really do that with an audience in mind. If you're going to work, you clothe yourself toward your office mates. If you're meeting with a client, you clothe yourself toward them. If you're going to sit at home and watch TV all day, then you clothe yourself toward that. And so there's a direction with which we are to clothe ourselves with humility. And this is the command that he's giving them. And what I see reading through this passage is I see basically 5 directions, 5 ways in which we are to clothe ourselves with humility toward. And so that's what we're going to go through. The first one's the most important. So 5 ways to clothe ourselves with humility. Number 1 is that we should be humble toward God. So it's right there, verse 6. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God. This is the foundational truth for all the rest. Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God. One of the things to understand early on in this topic is that there is such a thing as a created order. That according to the Bible, the universe that we live in was created not in just a random or haphazard way, but it was created in an orderly way. And you can see that in the universe, and you can see that right down to the tiniest minutia that we can see. Subatomic particles, right? There's order. And that's because there is a creator, right? Things have order because according to the Bible, there is a creator. And therefore, there are things that are created, and there is the one who is the creator. And the one who is the creator has authority over all of it. He's a unique person, God is, because he's the only one who has the authority of an author. The author has authority over his work. And part of that design is that things would have an order and that things would have authority over each other. That's part of God's design. Here's a very important piece of his design to understand is that as human beings, we rank below God in that created order. Okay? Which sounds obvious, okay, but it's the beginning of wisdom. It's very important to have this in mind. God's here and we're down here. That's the starting of it. That's the fundamental truth you need for humility. If you understand that, then you've got a good foothold on humility already. Here's Andrew Murray in his book called Humility. He says, when God created the universe, it was with the one object of making the creature, that's what he calls you and I in this book, the creature. I know it's insulting, but there's the creator and there's the creature. That's us. It was with the one object of making the creature partaker of his perfection and blessedness, and so showing forth in it the glory of his love and wisdom and power. But this was not a giving to the creature something which it could possess in itself. By no means. But as God is the ever-living, ever-present, ever-acting one, who upholds all things by the word of his power, and in whom all things exist, the relation of the creature to God could only be one of unceasing, absolute, universal dependence. The creature has not only to look back to the origin and first beginning of existence and acknowledge that it there owes everything to God, but also its chief care, its highest virtue, its only happiness, now and through all eternity, is to present itself an empty vessel in which God can dwell and manifest his power and goodness. Humility, then, he says, the place of entire dependence on God is, from the very nature of things, the first duty and the highest virtue of the creature and the root of every virtue. You want to be virtuous, he says? Do you want to be happy? Then the beginning place is to recognize I come from God, I exist from God and for God ultimately. The opposite of this would be pride. And so pride, Murray says, or the loss of this humility, is the root of every sin and evil. He's stating it strongly, but I think it's pretty compelling what he's saying. This is the clash between pride and humility. Humility basically means to be rightly oriented under God as a creature. And pride means to be oriented basically any way else. So think about it like a solar system. It's one of my favorite illustrations because in a solar system we can look out and we see the created order, right? There's order in a solar system. Namely, that things of small mass orbit things of large mass. And so it is orderly. And so humility in this illustration would be a planet or a satellite recognizing its station. This is my place, this is where I belong, and this is where I go and what I do. Pride would be like a planet saying, well, I don't like orbiting the sun. Why should I have to orbit anything? Why can't I maybe I'll just trek off into space and figure something out. Maybe I feel like orbiting the moon. Maybe Jupiter should orbit me. Maybe I'm the sun. And this is, of course, where pride always leads. Because if we take God out of the picture, then the next best substitute is always myself. So humility is to be oriented rightly under God, and pride is to not be oriented rightly under God, to be rather oriented around self. And this really renders two different worldviews. Depending on what you think on this subject, what is the center of the solar system? Depending on your answer to that question, that is going to color and shape your view of yourself, of every other person you interact with, and of course your view of God. So it is actually very important. It's really the most basic lens through which you can view the world around you. Pride, humility. Humility is rightly submitted under truth, whatever that may be. So the humble says, I don't make truth. My job is to figure out what's true and deal with that. Pride says, pride is always searching for truth that will submit to me. Pride is shopping for what it thinks is true. Humility is attracted to God, the orbit under which I belong. Whereas pride, did I say pride is attracted to God? I might have mixed it up. Humility is attracted to God. Pride is repelled from God as a threat to my self-rule. Pride needs to establish self-valuation. Pride's always hungry, right? Because you're that planet floating out there. You're always like, what am I doing? Am I where I'm supposed to be? Am I doing a good job? How do I know? Pride is insecure inherently. And so it's hungry. Whereas humility accepts God's valuation of me. Where I go depends on where He is. Pride always compares against others. You know, the other planets come by and it's like, well, what's that planet doing? Should I be doing what they're... How do I stack up compared to that planet? Other planets are basically a threat or something to compete with or compare against. Humility compares itself against God. And that helps us have a right relationship with the other satellites. Pride is restless, hungry, and anxious, and humility is essentially at peace because it's accepted the basis of reality. So when we factor God out of the equation, we're left with pride as the only alternative. That's really the condition of the human race, right? If I say there is no God, then what that leaves me with is that I should fend for myself. And humility makes no sense if there's no God. I mean, honestly, listen, let me just say right now, guys, if there is no God, then you should not be humble. Why would you be humble? You should make yourself the center of the universe, and you should get as many people to comply with that as possible, and you should contend for it and fight for it, and you better win. But if there is a God, then you should submit to him. It's pretty hard to argue with either one of those positions. And this is the fallen condition of mankind, a bunch of planets bouncing around, not quite sure or not whether we want to acknowledge the sun. And it gets pretty messy. So here's the thing. It says that God is opposed to the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Clothe yourself with humility toward one another because God is opposed to the proud. That is actually a pretty strong statement. He's quoting Proverbs 3. And hear what he's saying there. He's saying that God has a problem with human pride. The word there for oppose, antitasso, which means to array against in battle. You know when an army takes the field? And they, picture like the Roman army. They're coming out in their ranks and they're filling out in their order and they're taking up arms and they're standing ready for battle. That's tasso. And this word is antitasso. Arrayed against you. And I think it's a play on words because the word he just uses right there, the command is to hypotasso, which means to put yourself under. In other words, he's saying, fall in under where you belong, or else I will fall in against you, is what he's saying here. Which you gotta love. God's very unapologetic. God has a problem with human pride. When we say, I think I might be the center of the solar system, God takes the field. He's like, no, I object to that. I oppose you. Here's C.S. Lewis from Mere Christianity. He says, the essential vice, the utmost evil is pride. Unchastity, anger, greed, drunkenness, and all that are mere flea bites in comparison. It was through pride that the devil became the devil. Pride leads to every other vice. It's the complete anti-God state of mind. It is pride which has been the chief cause of misery in every nation and every family since the world began. Everything that's wrong with our world finds its root in pride. And that's why God's like, I oppose it. When you adopt that attitude, no, I oppose you. And therefore, by this logic, that makes humility the root of all virtue. If all sin springs from pride, then the beginning of all virtue is assuming our right position under God, to acknowledge his awesomeness, to act in accordance with the fact that there is a God and I am not him. It's a settled understanding of our place. That's how Christians are supposed to be. Here's Andrew Murray one more time. He says, when the creature realizes that this is the true nobility, and consents to be with his will, his mind, and his affections, the form, the vessel in which the life and glory of God are to work and manifest themselves, he sees that humility is simply acknowledging the truth of his position as a creature and yielding to God his place. It's this basic understanding. Here's what's true. And yielding the throne. And so therefore, humility is the essence of being grounded in reality. Romans 12, he says, don't think too highly of yourselves, but think so as to have sound judgment. Sanity. That that when we say, no, I'm not subject to God, that is an unsound place of mind. So God opposes the proud, and then there's another half of that saying, but he gives grace to the humble. So this is amazing because God, not only does he oppose the proud, but then when we adopt an attitude of humility, his response is grace. Grace is charity. Grace is generosity beyond what we deserve. The generous love of God. He says that's what the humble receive. Humility allows you to receive grace. Think about it. Can a proud person receive a gift that they don't deserve? No, never. If you come to God and say, I'll fill in all the blanks, I've got it all figured out for myself, but maybe I could take a little help from you. God's like, no deal. It's when we come to God and say, you're God and I'm not, and my hands are empty and I need to receive, it'll be but for the grace of God that I can go ahead. That God says, yes, that I can accept. And his response is to give. This is an essential point to get because it is an ingredient in understanding how salvation works. If you came here tonight trying to figure out, what would it take for me to be right with God according to the Bible, there is a key ingredient here, maybe the only part that's really on our plate. God's done everything through Jesus Christ. But it does require humility. It requires us to be humble enough to receive something that we don't deserve. Jesus Christ died on the cross for your sins, and he offers us righteousness and eternal life that we did not earn. And so therefore, I've got to have empty enough hands to say, I need to receive that gift. That's how you're made right with God, according to the Bible. Ephesians 2, God saved you by his grace when you believed. And you can't take credit for this. It is a gift from God. Well, this principle that God favors the humble, that remains relevant as we follow him in this life. It remains a wise truth, is that when I wake up in the morning and adopt a prideful attitude, which I do pretty often, I'm walking out of step with Christ. But when I adopt a humble attitude, God tends to notice that and reward it. So our heart is always inclined toward pride. That's true, okay? That's why they got me up here to teach this teaching, is because my heart is inclined. They were like, pride? Put Faust on it. Come on. Our heart is proud. And yet, the beauty of this passage is that there's an opportunity to choose here. I can, at any given point, choose a humble attitude. And when I do that, God says, I see that, and I will reward you. He says right here, therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God. Why? So that he may exalt you at the proper time. His audience is being mistreated and treated unjustly, and he's giving them the advice to return a blessing for a curse and not get the justice they deserve in that moment. This would be incredibly encouraging to them, this reminder that, hey, if you're unjustly humbled, if you're treated worse than you deserve, just remember that God will exalt you at the proper time. Jesus said, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. See that up-down language? You exalt yourself in pride, well, reality will catch up with you, and you will be humbled. But when we humble ourselves before God, then he lifts us up. Now, this has all been the idea. This is an argument for why you should humble yourself before God. The problem here in this passage is that what he really says is clothe yourself with humility toward one another, which is a totally different animal, right? It's one thing for me to get up here and say, guys, if there's a God, you should humble yourself before him. Who could really argue with that? If there's a God, yeah. But it's another thing to be like, actually, you should humble yourself before other people. Have you met people? Not that great. And this idea that I should humble myself before all of them? All of them? Come on. I've got to be better than some of you guys, right? I've got to be better than... How can he tell his audience to have a generally humble attitude toward one another. Well, here's where the other directions go. That is what he's saying, because look what he says here in verse 5. You younger men, likewise, be subject to your elders. So he just got done giving instructions to the elders about leading the church, and now he tells the younger men to subject to their leadership, to humble them. So this is the second direction. The first one was toward God. The second one is toward those who are over us. That you should humble yourself toward people who have authority over you. You guys are going to love this part. Okay? Everybody loves this part. I think that nowhere is our pride more evident than when it comes to leading and following. Anytime someone's in charge, someone's supposed to lead, someone's supposed to follow, the pride is very concerned about how this goes. But I think the important idea here is that picture changes when we put God in the center of the solar system. Without God, it's just a big arm wrestling match for power and influence over each other. But God is like this adult in the room. God is the sun in the center of the solar system, and he says, all you get in line around me, and I will worry about who's subject to who. So human authority is a feature of the created order. One of the first things God did. He has authority, but he delegated it to man. He gave man authority over the creation, for example. And so that is a feature, that humans get put in charge of other things. Without God, that usually ends up being bad. That usually ends up in people lording it over and harming the people under them. And yet, in an unfallen condition, subject to God, human authority can actually be a source for real good. It can even be a beautiful form of love, that we can lovingly exercise authority over each other. And I believe that in when we're all glorified, when we're in the new heaven and new earth, I believe that there will be we'll have the roles of submitting to one another in various ways. It's part of the created order. So just a reflection question. What are you like under authority? What's it like to lead you? I'm sure it's great. Maybe a good way to get at this would be to ask, what would it look like to be clothed with humility when I'm under the authority of someone else? What would be some of the characteristics? So pride, for example, likes to say, I could do it better. I should be in charge. My opinion is very important. These are things the pride says. Whereas humility says, look, God has others in authority. What can I learn from them? Pride says, I'm not getting the recognition I deserve. And you know what? Maybe you're not. The pride notices every time that happens. Pride also says that rank and titles are extremely important. But humility says, God will exalt me at the proper time. If I don't get the recognition I deserve, God notices everything, and he promises to exalt me at the proper time. Rather be recognized by him than by man anyway. Pride says, prove to me why I should submit to you in every single instance. And how can I find fault in your leadership? Whereas humility says, how can I encourage and pray for their success? How can I get behind their efforts? Humility is inclined toward submission. It's not blindly saying every leader is great. They're often not great. And yet I understand that in this dynamic, if you're the leader, then in this dynamic, my role is to support that, is to be behind that. That would be my virtuous part of that equation. Hebrews 13:17 says, obey your leaders and submit to them, for they keep watch over your souls, as those who will give an account, so that they may do this with joy, not groaning, for this would be unhelpful for you. And you can really hear the created order talking there, that he's saying, look, if the dynamic is such that you're following a leader, he's saying you should obey them, which would be advantageous for you. It would be better for you if they had an easier time leading, is what he's saying. Yeah, so this is worth thinking about. I know that not every leader is great. In fact, lots of the leaders, in Peter's time, they were subject to very evil governmental rulers. Peter himself had been flogged by governing authorities. So Peter's not under any illusions that humans can be nasty with authority. But his point is simply that there is virtue in following authority. And so if this is a topic for you that comes up a lot, if you're someone who, looking back through your life, if you've routinely clashed with and chafed against authority in various contexts in your life, may I suggest considering the role of your pride. You can find me in the parking lot and beat me up afterward. I don't struggle with it, so I don't know what you guys' problem is. just kidding. All right, well, if you hated that, there's another side of the coin. So let's keep reading. He says, "You younger men, likewise." Now, isn't this interesting? Because his instruction to them was a likewise. You know what that means, right? It means there's a corresponding, other piece to that puzzle. He just told the elders how to lead, and then he says, "You guys, likewise, be submissive and humble." That implies that the elders are supposed to be submissive and humble too. That implies that everything I just said and challenged by way of anyone under authority also goes for anyone who has authority. And just to remove all doubt, look what he says next. "And all of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another." Not just the younger men, all of you should clothe yourself with humility. So then we've got to ask this question: what does it look like to clothe myself with humility toward those under me? In any context. So in any context where you have authority, we've seen he's saying that those above need to have humility and those below need to have humility. So what would that look like? Humility is just as essential when you're leading as it is when you're following. And we just saw that last week, right? That should ring a bell. Because last week, what did he say? He said, "Shepherd the flock of God among you." And then in verse 3, he said, "Nor yet as domineering those assigned to your care." Not domineering, but proving to be examples to the flock. And he reminds them that there's a chief shepherd, that they themselves are under authority, and that their role is not to domineer. Jesus said in Mark 10:42, "You know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. But it's not this way among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all." These are the words of Jesus. Peter followed a guy who washed the disciples' feet, even though, he is the rightful center of the solar system. And what does he do with that? He shows humble love toward those under his care. So what would it look like to be clothed with humility when I have authority? So now I'm the authority. What would it look like to have humility as an authority? Well, pride would be saying things like, "Guess that makes me the center of the solar system. I'm the authority. Guess I'm a big deal." Whereas humility says, well, actually, I serve the chief shepherd by his grace. Not one of us in this room deserves any type of authority. And I need helped and checked by both God and man if I'm going to play that role. Pride says my opinion is very important. And feedback is a threat to my authority. My authority needs to be protected. I can't look bad. Whereas humility says, look, I'm a fool half the time. I relish feedback. Only God's opinion matters, and that may well come to me from those who are under me. Pride says my rank is what makes me important. And every outcome renders a verdict on my worth. How is this going? Says if I'm valuable or not, and also what are they saying about me? See, pride can be domineering and lording over. It can also be deeply insecure. It's usually both. Pride can be totally insecure because it's that planet wandering. It's not quite sure who should be in orbit over what. Humility says my security comes only from the grace of God, right? I've been loved by God when I didn't deserve it. That is my basis of security. God has given me a stewardship to carry out in His name. That's what it means to lead. He's entrusted something to me to carry out in His name. Prideful leaders can look overbearing or timid. And again, what's missing? It is to bring the matter under the mighty hand of God. It is to bring the matter into orbit, which cleans up all the messes. Bringing our leadership under God's authority produces humble confidence. That's the opposite of insecure pride. Pride is always insecure, but true humility builds a humble confidence, not based on my own goodness, but that I'm in orbit around the one who is good. All right, so that's 3 we've done so far. Be humble toward God. Clothe yourself with humility toward those above you in authority. Clothe yourself with humility toward those below you when you have authority. And now, for the 4th one, he's going to cast the net even broader. It's not just in these dynamics that have leadership roles where we need humility. He goes a step further. He says that you need to clothe yourself with humility toward one another. And that phrase has meaning in the Scriptures. One another. There's a whole series of one another passages that describe how we're supposed to interact in general as Christians. And you know some of these. Love one another, forgive one another, accept one another, admonish one another. People always forget, clothe yourself with humility toward one another. But it's there. And it implies that should be a regular part of our Christian life. One another means that it's reciprocal, so that I'm supposed to clothe myself with humility toward you, and you're supposed to clothe yourself with humility back toward me. It's reciprocal. And it means every Christian, which he explicitly states there in verse 5. All of you. This instruction is for all of us, back and forth and all the time. It should be a hallmark of our community, is that we are clothed with humility toward one another. See, I think Peter understands that in the fiery ordeal, what do you really need in a trial? You need each other. Peter understands that. And that's why why is humility so important in the fiery ordeal? Because we need each other. And humility happens to be the key to great relationships. I know I said that strongly, but I'll say it again. Humility is the key to great relationships. When there are problems in relationships, guess what's usually involved? Pride is at the heart of all of our relational problems. Think about it. Think back to a conflict that you were involved in. And I know you may have to think back years, but just think to a conflict and now ask yourself this question. What role did pride have on both sides? I bet it was there. Let's let Andrew Murray hit us again. He says, consider how all lack of love, all indifference to each other's needs, feelings, the weaknesses of others, all sharp and hasty judgments and utterances, so often excused under the plea of being outright and honest, all manifestations of temper and touchiness and irritation, all feelings of bitterness and estrangement have their root in nothing but pride. People say, oh, you really hurt my feelings. You know, your feelings, you can't hurt feelings. Feelings are your senses. You know, it didn't hurt your feelings, it hurt your pride. Pride's the thing that gets hurt. So yeah, think how many of your recent conflicts, parenting, friendship, work, fellowship, arose from pride on both sides. Probably a lot. Why is pride so bad for relationships? I thought that would make a good discussion question if we were doing this in a discussion format. Why is pride so bad? So what I did was I just brainstormed my own answer to this question. Here's my answer to my own question. I think pride's so bad for relationships because it's overconfident and insecure at the same time. It has something to prove. It needs you for something. Pride is defensive. Pride is competitive. Pride can't apologize. Pride hates to be corrected. Pride won't take help. Pride can only see the other's fault and can't allow that it has fault of its own. Pride is afraid of being exposed and embarrassed, so it can't be real. Pride makes you fake. I saw some people snap pictures of that slide. Just be careful who you text that to, don't just send that to someone, your wife. Check this out. Just kidding. Yeah, so conversely then, humility must be the key to great relationships. And I think that's true. Why? Because it's secure in its station. Because it's oriented in reality. Because it's free from the project of proving your worth. It's free from comparing. It doesn't need people to prop it up, but it can receive help. It doesn't need to hide faults or posture. It's not surprised or threatened by correction. It can own mistakes and ask for forgiveness. It's free from self-obsession and therefore free to genuinely love. It is the beginning of all wisdom. We submit ourselves to God, and from there we can practice love. Yeah. So a challenge then, is there a relationship in your life that is fraught? Like that's been popping into your head as I've been giving this talk. You know, I think a good step would be to take this before God and say, I need to submit this under your mighty hand. You know, maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, but am I first and foremost subject to you? Sometimes we're right, but we're also proud. And that's part of the problem. You can be right and proud at the same time. I have had situations where I've had to return to people and say, you know, we don't agree on this issue, but one part of this I can own is that I have not clothed myself with humility toward you in our interaction, and I can own that part. You don't hear many apologies for clothing ourselves with pride, which is curious, considering how often we do it. So yeah, perhaps you need to bring the matter in humility under the mighty hand of God. All right, last one. So humble yourselves toward God. Humble yourself toward those above you. Humble yourself toward those below you. Humble yourself toward everyone, one another. And lastly, he says, cast all your anxiety on him because he cares about you. Now this last line is so interesting because it's like a different topic, right? And yet it's totally connected. He's like, while you're doing this, remember, having cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. I think this is related. This is a fifth direction, which is toward our worries. Or maybe a way to say it is humble yourself toward God in the midst of your worries, your troubles, and your anxieties. It might seem out of place, because the other ones are relationships, but I don't think it is because remember the context here. Peter understands this is the crying need. They are afraid. They are worried. They are suffering, and the forecast is for more. And so what does he say? He says, guys, with those worries and those fears, as you go through the fiery ordeal, one thing, make sure to humble yourself under the mighty hand of God. Why? How does humility help with my worries? That's the question that it brings up for me, right? How is that going to help if I'm feeling fearful or worried? And my answer to that is it helps tremendously. And I can say that as a person I'm an anxious person. Anxiety, that's part of my life. And there is a relationship between humility and peace in the midst of worry. The reason is because what drives a lot of anxiety is pride. So you know what's really stressful? Trying to be God when you're not. That is stressful. That, planet Earth, if it tried to be the sun, it would probably get super stressed out and worried, right? For good reason. When you read materials on anxiety therapies, there's many good ones, and there's a lot of good truths in them. One kind of theme that comes up a lot, that you hear a lot of people say, is there's basically two things that anxious people need to wrestle with and come to grips with. Two facts of life that are not easy to swallow, but are undeniably true. Okay, and here they are. It is that, number one, you're limited. We have to accept our limitations. A lot of what drives anxiety is me trying to get on top of situations and control my circumstances. If I could fix this or that, then I wouldn't worry, and we get it spun out on that. We need to accept that I'm limited. I can influence some things in the world, but not all that much, and some things I can't influence at all. That is a fact of life. Number two is accepting uncertainty. So another thing that drives anxiety are the what ifs. what if this happens? What if that happens? And if I could just anticipate and forecast all the what ifs, then I could head off all the problems. But this is a fool's errand because you can't. And so what happens is we get increasingly anxious and worried the more we try to control and know everything. So, the key is to accept these two facts of life, which no one can deny these two things, and yet none of us really wants to believe them. You know what makes it much easier to swallow these facts of life? Having a God, with a capital G, God in the field of view. That makes these much more tolerable. You know, I'm limited. I'm not all-powerful, but He is. I'm not all-knowing, but He is. And so if I hitch my wagon to Him, then I can take all of these fears and anxieties and I can cast them upon Him where they belong. I can accept that I'm limited and I am uncertain because there is one who is not limited and who is not uncertain. Someone is in control. And I can humble myself under His mighty hand. The hand of God. In the Bible, the hand of God is associated with His action. God who can act. That God is in control. And that God cares for you. These two facts, He includes both of them here. That His hand is mighty and that He cares. There's actually a play on words. Cast your cares upon Him because He cares for you. Cast your worries upon Him because He's worried about you. I remember when I was about 18 years old, I had to have this terrible surgery. I had to have my tonsils out because they were infected with abscess. And I'll spare you the details, okay? It was terrible, though. The surgery had problems. I had to go back 3 times the following week to have the site cauterized. Use your imagination, okay? And I remember the 3rd time was the most severe and the most painful. My parents couldn't take me, and my grandfather had taken me. And so I remember it was kind of awkward because I sat in this chair, and they did this very painful thing, and I was suffering, and then they left the room, and it was just the 2 of us alone, and I was sort of crying. And he just sat in the back of the room, and he didn't say anything. And I remember, looking back, it's like he probably didn't know what to say. Like, what are you going to say? But what he did do is, I remember after a little while, he came over and he just he stood behind me and he just put his hands on the back of my shoulders. And he had these great big, heavy hands. He just laid them there. And that really helped a lot. And that's what I always think about when I read, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God. My grandpa cared, but he could not do anything about it. God cares for you and can do all. And so that is the one place to go with your anxieties, to bring them under the mighty hand of God. We can leave our worries with the one person who can do something. When something's bothering you, isn't it amazing how far down the list God is? I'll complain, I'll take a nap, I'll talk to 5 people before it ever occurs to me to talk to God about my problems. And yet He's the one of those people who actually cares and the one who can actually do anything. So what is that? That's my pride. I want to handle it myself without Him. And I still do. It's still true of me now. But the lesson is that when difficulties come, that's my cue. It's time to take up my place under the mighty hand of God. Is there something that's beyond your control? Is there something that is keeping you up at night? God's inviting you to come and bring that to Him. Please throw that upon me, He says, because I care for you. It is a great encouragement, especially when we're suffering from things that we can't control. So this is God's way. It is hard on the pride to humble ourselves, but it is the way of true freedom and confidence, which is what God has for us. So there's His challenge on humility And that squares us up for our last passage, which we'll get to next week. We've got one more in 1 Peter 5. Got to talk about the lion. That's what we'll do next week.